the process?
I think yes, but it's going to be much more the state's responsibilities to keep an eye on it. I mean, I think all level of accountability, even from, people missing build out milestones, not providing the service they're saying, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, all the way to intentional just fraud. I'm sure there's going to be, like in any program, at least some small percentage of it. But really it's, I mean, and the NTIA plan requires the states to explain what they're going to do with respect to accountability. And so, I think NTIA is going to be willing to help, but also looking for a plan from the states.
Paul, how, one of my concerns, these are questions I'm getting from particularly some of the people now literally campaigning for and watching this very closely because they're ready to make a campaign issue of it in the fall, is, what does the state have to do to build up these capabilities? You were chief of staff at the FCC, actually, I guess head of OPP, right? But what is the, how large were the federal staff? Because I know they had, I always had great respect for the economists and the technologists at the FCC and the lawyers. How much staff did the FCC have to administer the universal service programs, the RDOF programs, et cetera, et cetera? Because our RDOF, for example, is taken the federal government now. God, we're in month 15 from the awarding of the auctions, and they still haven't finished even announcing the awardees. So how large a staff did it take the FCC to do this job?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but you have to remember also almost all the administration is outsourced to USAC, right? So the Universal Service Administration company that has hundreds of staff, I think. But on the other hand, they're administrating at a national level, like the FCC. But you're right. Look, I think it's one of the, and I think on the broadband, on the state, your state folks talked about this, and it's going to be a challenge for all the states to staff up and get people with the right skills, and make the, depending on how they're making the awards, right? Actually, do all the reviews, even for NTIA, right? I mean, it's a challenge to review all the documents, review all the plans, review all the applications, make a decision, do the allocations. It's I think the administrative challenge, as I mentioned, right, the administrative challenge is certainly one of the cons of this sort of delocalization. Because to your point, right, I mean, the RDOF process and even the CAF process and even historically universal service processes have all been fairly mechanical, right? I mean, it's a mechanical auction, it's a mechanical formula to allocate the money based on costs. This, in a way, is even more complicated, right? Because there's so much more discretion. So if you get 50 applications for your area and they're all claiming to serve different but overlapping locations, and they all have different costs and technologies, and they're different providers with different track records and credibility, like someone has to review all that stuff. And then most importantly, if I'm asking for $100 of subsidy, someone has to decide, look, maybe I only really needed $10. Maybe I really need $200. And so, if you fund me, you're going to fund a project that's going to fail in 2 years. It's a big task.
Yeah, and just to probably sound like I'm beating no, I won't use that phrase. It's not a good one. Beating on, what. But in North Carolina, some of the early warning signs for those of you on the call is originally North Carolina announced that the project submission date for great grants was April 4th. That's now been already slipped to May 4th. I don't know how much of that was due to lobbying by service providers, how much of that was due to counties not ready to partner, and how much of that was the state not ready. Also, Angie on the call today, and she's working hard, but she announced that the completing access to broadband guidelines would not be available for another month. In January, it was going to be available in February. In February, she announced it was going to be available in March. Now we're in April, and she now announced it won't be available till late May at the earliest. So things aren't going in the right direction yet. Hopefully we'll get our act together. But I think all of us, at the local level need to do all we can to help our county officials, but also all we need to be leaning on our state legislatures and all to make sure they're doing, keeping the pressure on the executive branch to execute.
Yeah. And the other just thing I'll say, Snag, I think, which is, I mean, I think all of us probably on this call have been involved in one way or another in previous broadband projects. And it's hard, right? There's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of difficulty on the technical side, on the economic side, on the billing, customers. Like, it's not trivial to do this stuff. And so I think one of the questions for a lot of the states is going to be, look, we just don't have, 60 people to run this program. So the easiest thing to do is just give the incumbents what they ask for, because you can at least they know what they're doing, they're going to be able to execute. But then, a lot of the communities may not be super excited about just having the incumbents get the money. On the other hand, if there aren't really the resources to do detailed diligence, it's not on lots of different providers, it's not clear what choice people have. So, I mean, one of the things I think that's going to be a challenge is the states, because of lack of management resources, sort of reverting to simplicity, and then simplicity leading to overpayment or underperformance. That being said, look, there is money of all these hundreds of millions of dollars and billions of dollars that are flowing. I mean, I think 5% or 10%, 5%, I think, you're allowed to spend on administration, which is meant to scale up the broadband offices. The digital equity grants explicitly have planning money. BEAD explicitly has planning money. So I actually think almost the constraint is less money. It's going to be finding people who, have the experience to be able to do the job. And that's, like, as we all know, right? I mean, they're basically, every broadband office in every state is building effectively an investment venture capital firm, right? I mean, it's like, they're going to have hundreds of $1 millions to give out to different providers with different business propositions. And just finding those people is going to be challenging. I mean, if you guys have one thing that I've been talking to some other states about is MBA students or economic students or people looking for internships, just because a lot of this isn't necessarily super complicated, but it requires just manpower to get it done.
I've got another question that I keep getting told, don't go back there, but nobody else has it. Well, let me pause. I don't want to monopolize.
If any other people on the call want to jump in or comment, please don't hesitate.
This is Robin Ramsey with Senator Burr's office. I have a quick, I have a real quick question. When you were giving your presentation at the beginning, you were talking about the funding, where it's going to go. And you had mentioned policy and how you were going to, or some of the monies was going to go towards policy and that. I guess I just need you to elaborate on that a little bit, if you could, please. Do you remember talking about that portion?
In terms of the discretion that the states have on making policy choices?
Yes, exactly. And helping those who are more helpful to broadband. I think I picked up on that.
Yeah, no, it's so essentially there's three, and tell me, Robin, if I'm not speaking to what you're thinking, just tell me. But there's three levels I think that need to happen here, right? So there's the legislation which establishes the very broad framework, like unserved means 25.3, or not having 25.3. Underserved means not having 120. Projects have to get done in 4 years, so on and so forth. Like at a very high level, and then the NTIA is going to put out this notice of funding opportunity, the NOFO, so-called, in the next few weeks, which is then going to be sort of the guidance to states in terms of what the states have to submit in order to actually get their allocation of the money. And so that's going to be then, I think, one level deeper of policy, right? So NTIA will say things like, you know, when you're doing your scoring system to evaluate different proposals, why, you know, maybe you should weight fiber versus fixed wireless, you know, 3-to-1 or whatever it is. And then the states are going to have to come up with like the real detailed policy proposals, which are really the nitty gritty of how are they going to spend the money, right? Literally, how are they going to decide amongst proposals? How are they going to spend the money? How are they going to ensure accountability? And you know, I think one of the challenges, in a way, I mean, it's an opportunity and a challenge, right? So the opportunity is that lets states really tailor their policy choices to what the state wants to do and what their localities and communities want to do. And NTIA is going to require the states, as part of their plan, to explain how they're talking to localities and how they're, you know, it's not just the state level making all the decisions, but they're actually in communication and getting input from more local levels. But it does leave the states, I think, a lot of room for choice with respect to what they want to do with the money. And then I think that if you assume, and I think North Carolina, for example, will have enough money from these programs to actually do fiber to the home to all unserved locations, if that's what the state wants to do, or at least, you know, 99.9% or so of them. But making that choice, but that would be a policy choice, right? Because an alternative would be, well, you know, we're happy to do fixed wireless in some places and fiber in others, or, you know, we're happy to do satellite here, and somehow that policy choice is going to have to be, the state is going to have to make that. That's like a state discretion, and different states are going to end up in different places, I think. And that's going to take some time, and it's sort of a one-time thing, right? This is the chance for the state to decide, you know, this sort of once in a lifetime kind of hundreds of millions of dollars, like how to ensure that you know, you get the infrastructure that you need and that will serve people sort of in perpetuity and be viable, right? So, because, you know, the other thing you don't want, obviously, is to spend all this money and then in 3 years have a bunch of projects go bankrupt because there's not money to maintain them, or the revenue's not meeting the ongoing costs or whatever. And so that's not a trivial task, I think. But I don't know, Robin, does that address what you were going to, or were you asking about something else?
No, that is perfect. Thank you so much for delving into that a little bit deeper.
No,
I appreciate it.
No, not at all. Thank you for joining.
Paul, let me ask you whether there's any chance you think of legislation that would address what I think is one of the fundamental problems that will still remain after all this funding flows, because the funding won't cover 100%. In fact, I think in parts of Western North Carolina, we'll be lucky if it covers 50 to 75% of the unserved. And that is, you know, the 96 Telecom Act was based on primarily replacing the universal service regulation and mandates that the telephone companies operated on with competition. And basically, we have a market failure there once you get out of low cost, high density areas. So we'll be lucky to have a single wired broadband infrastructure to 98% of the homes. We will get cellular in many areas as an alternative, but there's still going to be areas that are unserved. Should there still be you know, mandatory service, right? It used to be a cable provider, when they got a franchise from the local government, had to build out to everybody in the franchised area or negotiate why they wouldn't. You know, that oversight's gone away in North Carolina. That went to the state, and the states have no mandates on the cable companies for build out. Telcos now don't have to build out because broadband's regarded legally still as a competitive service. You know, should we be revisiting that whole question of, you know, mandated coverage, or will the competitive marketplace between the alternatives of cellular, satellite, and wireline meet that need?
I mean, I think the hope is that there is enough money to get to basically 99.9%. And then you overlay that on. So the solution that's proposed at this point, or that will be tried first, right, is not sort of mandating the companies to cover everyone, but saying how much money do you need to make to provide the incentive to cover everyone? And, hundreds of millions of dollars should be enough to do that in almost all states. And so, between that and, as I mentioned, the LEO satellite guys and other sort of unsubsidized offerings. I mean, let me put it this way. I think if we're talking 5 years from now, if 99.9% of people in North Carolina don't have access to at least 120 broadband, then something went wrong in the process, because there are enough resources to get there, both in terms of subsidizing affordability for people who can't necessarily afford it, plus obligating a low price option for anyone who's taken subsidies to build broadband, plus the amount of money that's available to deploy broadband. Those three prongs should, if there's enough will and policy choices to do it, should be able to get you to basically universality. No, as I said, look, I mean, if converse, like what are the big risks? I mean, the things we talked about already, right? I mean, if people are getting much more money in subsidy than they need, then there won't be enough money. The state's going to run out of money. If there isn't accountability for people who take the money to actually build the service, right? So, I say I'm going to do it in 4 years and it takes me 10 years or I never get around to it. That's going to be a problem, right? The money's gone. No one's got any service. If providers who are maybe not with good intention, but are not actually, don't turn out actually able to run broadband service, end up getting it, that's going to be a problem. So there's certainly, I mean, it's certainly not easy, but there is enough, at least purely on subsidy terms, there shouldn't need to be any further sort of mandates or regulation to get to universality.
I hope you're right. I mean, when I look at the numbers in Western North Carolina, I'm not sure there is enough money the way North Carolina is flowing the money, because North Carolina only recognizes $1,000 per household difference in the way they score funding proposals. And we're seeing,
but that may not apply to BEAD, right? I mean, they may not score BEAD the same way.
that it could be, but right now, the way they score in North Carolina really puts Western North Carolina at a severe disadvantage compared to the rest of the state in competing for funds. Now, there's more than enough funds to go around. That's a moot point. But if the funds fall short, then we know where the shortfall hits. And the service providers around here, I'm frequently seeing in not low density areas, I mean, in medium density areas in Western North Carolina, major service providers are coming in with costs of $8,000 to $20,000 per household. Now, it's maybe because they're, pigs belling up to the trough, but they're coming in, it's not coming in at $1,000 to $3,000 per household.
But I think so. I mean, this goes to what Robin was asking a little bit, right? I mean, this would be an example in my mind, not to pick on you. Look, I mean, if a state says, if the federal government says to the state, here's $500 million, that's more than enough actually to build out entire broadband. And then if the state says, well, great, I'm going to give all that $500 million to the northern part of the state and nothing to the southern part of the state, I mean, I would classify that as a policy failure. And how can that be caught, right? I mean, NTIA has to review the plan, right? So NTIA will probably say, no, you can't do that, right? That's not an acceptable plan. You don't get your $500 million until you have something more reasonable. Obviously people in the state, the idea of devolving this to state level is that, people in the state don't let the states get away with that kind of stuff. So the people in the south of the state revolt and demand their money and so on and so forth. But, So I mean, I don't think we should stipulate the policy failure and then sort of worry about it, right? I mean, the point is, if there is a good, if you're worried about a policy failure in terms of the intra-state distribution, then in theory, the two safety nets to catch that are intra-state and NTIA review of the plans.
Yeah. Okay. That well said, Paul. As usual, you get to the key point. And so I think for those of us from Western North Carolina on the call, we really need to help our representatives at the state and county level understand these issues, because my somewhat cynical perception is our recent state laws have been very much driven by the large incumbent lobbyists of the large incumbent telcos who've done what they should do. They're trying to push the money to where they'll get the largest return on investment. And our Western legislatures have been naive and asleep at the switch. I'll say it that bluntly. So we've got to now correct that. So.
And one of the well, one other thing I'll say, Stegan, I know some states are doing this, and I wouldn't be surprised if NTIA ends up doing it too. Is developing a kind of a cost curve or cost so that you can go to the state and say, look, all unserved locations are not created equal. Here's the cost curve. Some of them are $20,000 and some of them are $1,000. And so when you're thinking about giving money, don't give $20,000 to the ones where the cost is 1,000, and don't give 1,000 to the ones where the cost is 20,000, because that's not going to be a good answer. But having an independent view of that cost curve, as I say, I imagine that. Well, I know a lot of states are developing that. I don't know whether North Carolina. I think Sarah mentioned that was on, or one of the panelists mentioned that was on sort of the state to-do list of sort of trying to look at the business cases and the economics. But that I think would help. Maybe, at least in some states, I think people are viewing that will help overcome the problem that you identified, Stag, right? Because look, otherwise it's hard to know, right? I mean, if I was sitting at a state broadband office and I'm getting a bunch of proposals and they're covering sort of different, maybe overlapping areas, but different numbers of locations and different technology, like how do I go about? I mean, one says I need $1,000 and one says I need $10,000. Like, I need to have. It's going to be very hard for me to decide if I don't have some independent view of the economics and the required subsidies.
Yeah, yeah.
And one thing, my view is that the handing out the BEAD money, the $42.5 million, is a huge shift in the way we distribute broadband funding, because the FCC used to dole out most of the money. NTIA had one of its own programs, agriculture hands out some, but this is handing it to states. And it seems to me that an advantage of that is they're closer to the situation and what is needed. Although I would say that localities probably have more knowledge, but so that has an advantage. But one of the disadvantages that the people who can exert politics into the situation may have a stronger role at state agencies than in the federal government, which is a disadvantage.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. That's exactly. I mean, I think the sort of the need to build up the expertise. I mean, whether or not you like the FCC, it's hard to argue they're not down the learning curve with respect to handing out money, right? Now every state has to go down the learning curve depending on where they're starting to do that efficiently. You're going to have 50 parallel processes, as it were, which is, again, pros and cons, but somewhat inefficient. And you're right, there's more. I mean, I think one of the criticisms of all the FCC programs, Universal Service, CAF, RDOF, has been there hasn't been enough role for states and localities, right? It's the federal government handing money to providers without maybe really being aware, as you said, exactly, Greg, right, or aware of the local circumstances or knowing where the unserved locations are, all these kind of things. And now I think the pendulum with BEAD is completely the opposite, right? It's a pretty limited role for the federal government, and really the states having all the responsibility and the rights and responsibilities, as it were, of handing out the money. And I think you're right. That's sort of pro and con.
And is there anybody else in the room that would like to ask some questions? We don't mean to dominate it. The other thing that and just speak up if you'd like to participate. The one thing that's good, I think, for North Carolina is we have a fairly sophisticated broadband office that has been around before this act was there. And of course, they have to ramp up and get the staffing, but other states are not going to be in that same position.
Yeah, no, it sounded like your guys are super competent. I mean, those were great. And I think, yes, you're starting way ahead of many, many other states, certainly, which is outstanding.
Is there anybody else? You know, one thing that has been on my mind is coordination among agencies and states. There has been this philosophy that was adopted somewhat beforehand that we shouldn't be putting government funding into locations or providers that are actually providing a minimal level of broadband in a particular area, that we should only be doing it once, that we shouldn't be funding multiple providers. But now we've got money at the NTIA. It has some that it's deciding. We have it at agriculture. We have it at FCC. We're going to have it in 50 states. How do you coordinate all that stuff?
So it's going to be the state's responsibility to ensure that locations aren't funded multiple times. And so, you know, I think maybe, Greg, and what you said, there's two separate issues, right? So one issue is, look, if I have a location that's going to cost me $100 to serve, you as the policymaker don't want me to go collect $100 from the FCC and then collect $100 from the state and then collect $100 from agriculture through Reconnect, and then, you know, make off with $300 for my $100 single location. So that sort of double or triple dipping is definitely not going to be allowed, and the state's going to have to keep an eye on it, and the federal government will try and coordinate their programs as much as possible. But I think that's definitely not gonna happen. I mean, obviously, I'm sure some stuff will slip through, but conceptually, that's definitely going to be prohibited, the multiple dipping. You know, the other piece of what you said, which I think is a little trickier, is a sort of the tension between providing subsidies to serve locations where there's zero providers. So if there's zero, you know, if you get it up to one provider, that you're probably doing pretty good, right? It's a bit much to expect they're going to be multiple, versus the goal of competition with respect to providing people choice and you know, limiting price increases and things like that. And so in the BEAD program, for example, right, a project, right? So whatever can't be fewer than 80% unserved locations. So your project can be 20% already served locations and 80% unserved locations. So there's some mix there, and that will bring some competition. And then, as I mentioned, you know, everyone's obliged to offer a low-cost option. So that will sort of help, even if you only have one provider, I think, substitute for the effects of competition. But it is a tension. But I think those are the two separate things, right? Definitely no double dipping. On the other hand, you know, you probably will see more effective competition because of the subsidies and the providers who get them.
Now, Chris Utesh put in a question in the chat about whether there are going to be any future changes to speed thresholds for unserved and underserved areas at the FCC once they come up with new maps and there is a fifth commissioner. Do you think that there's going to be a change in the minimum speed threshold?
Well, you know, to some extent, it doesn't matter as much anymore, because all the BEAD money and almost all the federal programs and state programs, the unserved standard is 25.3, but when you're building, you have to build to at least 120, right? So de facto, that means pretty much everyone, once this funding has gone through and is built, you know, the natural definition of broadband is going to end up being 120, because basically there aren't going to be anyone left for 25.3 or slower. And in fact, it'll probably end up being higher, because if, as I suspect, most states end up doing a lot of fiber, you'll end up getting even higher than 120. So I think to some extent, the problem it will be solved without changing the definition, but also the fact of the FCC's definition is going to make less difference, right? Because the maps, I'm sure you're going to be able to click, even like the current 477 maps, and say, you know, I want to see all the unserved locations if I define unserved as 120, or if I define it as 25.3, or if I define it as 500, 100. So, you know, the current FCC maps let you do that, and I'm sure the future FCC maps will do that. And the definition of 25.3, once this round of money's gone through, won't really therefore matter for anything very much. So whether the FCC changes it or not, you know, I mean, it would make sense to conform it to 120, but I just it just doesn't really matter as much. You know, when I was there during 2007 to 9, we changed the broadband definition. That was when it was changed from 4.1 to 10.1 to 25.3, and it made a lot of difference then because all the funding, the universal service funding, was being allocated based on that. But now that won't be the case anymore, so I don't think it matters as much.
Hey, Bill, do you want to ask your question or you want me to ask it?
Go ahead, Gregory, if you would.
Okay, so Bill asked, after the September 1st deadline for submitting location fabric data at the FCC for the new maps, how long is it going to take the FCC to sort the new data and issue the new maps? This is pretty specific compared to what we talked about in the general session.
Yeah, so you probably saw, like, on Friday, the FCC gave the carriers the preliminary fabric data so they could take a look at it. And so, I think to answer your question, the FCC maps will come out October, November would be my guess. The first cut of the so that other people are aware, there's two levels. The fabric, the so-called fabric, is where are the locations that are potentially serviceable by broadband, and then you overlay on that what the actual coverage is. So you have the fabric, which is the locations, and then you have the coverage data, and then the two together sort of are the map, as it were. And that map is obviously continuing to evolve. So, to me, I think of it more as, less of a map in the sense of an atlas that sits on your shelf and you can go and look up the unserved, and more in the sense of like a software product where there's a new release every 6 months, because all the carriers, subsidized and unsubsidized, are building out broadband like crazy. You've got all, new fixed wireless, you've got all the subsidized deployments from all the different programs that Greg mentioned. So this is like a totally moving target for the map, which really needs to also therefore be a moving target. But to Bill's question, the first, hopefully pretty decent, although I'm sure there'll be a lot of challenges, and all the challenges will get an insane amount of coverage, and the headlines will all be like, map totally screwed up, challenges here, challenges there. But in reality, the map will probably be 90-95% good, and it might take 5 years to nail down the last corner case of is that apartment building really 7 units or 6 units, or is that trailer park, like last month it was like 5 trailers and now it's 7 trailers, what's up with the map that says 6, and all those kind of corner cases, right? But good enough for the NTIA to allocate funding amongst the states, which is really just pro rata, right? So if you assume it's wrong by roughly the same amount in every state, then you don't really need to get it perfect to do the NTIA allocation, which is just the percentage of your unserved. And that's going to be, so the FCC maps will come out, my guess, November-ish. The NTIA will then have to decide how much of the FCC challenge process they want to wait for before they use the maps to do the allocation. My guess is they won't want to wait that long as the maps are decent, And so that means that the NTIA can start, in Q1 of 23, start to allocate money out to the states, hopefully, or at least let the states know how much money they're going to be getting, plus or minus a few percent, which will be great. And then, as I said, I think the harder task is for the states, because when they start giving out money, that has to be on maps that are accurate, right? Because you don't want to be missing locations that you ought to be funding, and then that process will drag. Will go on through 23. And as I said, the trouble is, because it's a moving target, it's just going to be hard. Okay, does that answer the question?
Absolutely does. Thank you. And it's earlier than I anticipated, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
Well, but I have to say, being a lawyer and watching other proceedings, that if the maps are changed significantly enough, even if it's only 0.5% and 1%, does the state of Hawaii sue because it got out, $20 million went to New York instead of Hawaii? And so are they going to challenge this process if new iterations of the map prove them right?
It's a good question. And I think the way to get around it would be, if the map, let's just make it up. Once the map, let's say the first iteration of the map is 95% good enough. I suspect it'll be higher than that, but the NTIA could give out, I'm not saying they will do this, but conceptually, they could allocate 90% of the money and then kind of keep the rest in escrow whilst the uncertainty in the maps is sorted out in future iterations. Because the NTIA doesn't have to write one single check to the states and then they're done, right? I mean, even the legislation says NTIA, will release some money after the first draft of the plan and of the state's plans, and then the rest of the money after the final draft of the plans. But they could do it, I think, in more increments if the maps are evolving too. So that might help get over your problem, Greg. But I'm sure there'll be litigation. That's usually a safe. That's usually a safe bet. Right?
Anytime that the amount in dispute is above $1 million, it's probably worth it.
Yes, I'm sure you're right. And also, I'm guessing there'll be some dispute around, if the NTIA, again, back to the very first question about the NTIA's implementation of the legislation and whether they're over constraining the states or under constraining them and all these kinds of things. Too, if NTIA ends up turning down a state plan, is that going to get appealed? All those guys, I have no idea. Not being a lawyer, I have no idea how all that stuff works. But it does seem like it's a lengthy process with lots of money at stake. To your point, and so I'm sure there'll be some friction.
I was confused about one thing. How does fixed wireless fit into getting BEAD money if the speed needs to be 100 over 20?
So the claim is fixed wireless mostly is fine for that. Oh, I guess we're about to get cut off. So fixed wireless, I think the debate between 120 versus 100 symmetric. So fixed wireless is okay for 120. It starts having more trouble when you're getting up to 100.
Okay.
And so if you want to use speed as a proxy for technology choice, symmetric sort of leads you towards fiber and away from cable and away from fixed wireless. Speed and asymmetry to some extent leads you towards, then pulls in coax, and then speed with more asymmetry pulls in fixed wireless. So that's, I think, part of the way the states are going to be able to sort of do the technological choice. I think we're about to get the.
Yeah, we're about to get dumped back into the regular grid.
Well, so thank you for everyone for joining and taking the time today. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Unlimited hops, sorry, I was muted there. Unlimited hops and delivers symmetrical speeds up to 1 gig. And so when you think of Wi-Fi, you tend to think of hotspots. Go beyond that and think of, let's say, any area you can think of, as long as it's deployed. Think of the Wi-Fi being deployed like a blanket pulling over a bed where there are no dead spots and you can walk. Yes.
We are back in the main session now. It sounds like you're wrapping up a breakout, which is great to hear there was that level of engagement. But I do want to turn it over to Deborah to do a review of what we have learned in those breakout sessions.
Okay.
Yeah, we were doing some exciting stuff there, so we'll have to find a way to continue that. But I just want to introduce myself quickly. I'm Deborah Porto, chair of the Hayward County Broadband Committee, and most of you have committees in your areas, but we have some great representation. We meet monthly. If anybody wants to learn more about what we're doing, we'd be happy to share that. And I just also want to take a call out to the rest of the members in the far western that are in Swain, Leonard, and Julie, Macon, Jeff Lee, and in Jackson, Robin Starks. They do a fantastic job, somewhat herded by Russ. But we had some really great talk in the breakout session, and I was in the funding one. But we'd like to hear about 3 or 4 minutes from each of the leaders of the breakout sessions. And then we'll go through a little discussion about where we're going to go next, call to action, and have Bill wind us up. So if we could start with Paul from the federal policy session, could you give us 3 or 4 minutes wrap up of your session, please?
Sure. I don't know, Greg, do you want to do it? You were sort of chairing our breakout.
No, I'm happy to do it, Paul. If
Yeah,
you,
good.
I was taking notes here. I figure since you were doing a lot of the talking, it would be hard. We talked a bit about how you prevent waste, fraud, and abuse, since the FCC has had problems with this, and it was noted that the states probably have to pay attention to this very carefully to make sure that there is no abuse in their processes. It was pointed out that there are going to be staffing issues on the part of the states and the federal government in order to perform all the tasks that there are in handing out the money. And in response to a question, are 100% of all locations going to get served? Paul's opinion was that it's enough to do the job properly if the job is done properly, and that it's probably not going to be 100%. It's going to be 99% or 99.5%. There are some really intractable problems that are going to make 100% probably very difficult. And it was also pointed out there's going to have to be more coordination from FCC, from federal agencies who all have broadband funding authorities to make sure they're not duplicating funding. And now the states are going to have to add that role to make sure that money is used wisely. And that's basically the things that we talked about. There were some other issues, but.
Okay, that sounds great. I mean, such an important area, and that waste and fraud part always is a concern. Maggie or Aaron for digital inclusion, could you give us a summary of your session, please?
Yeah, we had a dynamic discussion. We kind of opened it up to the group to ask questions that came out of the session so far, and then did a little bit of dreaming about what could Western North Carolina do now in order to make sure that it continues to be digitally inclusive. We talked a lot about engaging trusted groups and getting the word out about the Affordable Connectivity Program. So whether those are libraries, schools, churches, it kind of depends on the community itself. We also talked about different resources. So the National Digital Inclusion Alliance has a coalition guidebook to help guide you on how to bring a group or a coalition together to develop digital inclusion planning. The North Carolina Broadband Infrastructure Office has a template that we also shared. And then finally, Aaron ended by sharing about the Digital Navigator Core that's through the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, but is placing a full-time digital navigator in 18 rural counties or tribal regions across the United States. And he shared some more information about how to apply to that. Aaron, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to uplift from that discussion.
That was a great summary. I think just one other discussion topic. There was some really robust conversation around competition and what competition means for improving access and affordability. And in light of some policy restraints on municipal broadband and certain options, what some other ways to kind of work around that might be, both in kind of practical strategies to encourage competition, and then also, just kind of encouraging among this group advocacy to encourage competition. And if there are policy barriers that can be removed to that, some strategy around how to develop some advocacy there.
Great summary. I think one of the things that caught my attention, you talked about working with trusted groups. So I think one of the issues that we certainly find in the Far West is people who are working on access aren't necessarily the best people to work on inclusion. They're two different skill sets. So I'm hoping these plans will address some of those issues. Great, thanks a lot. Let's hear now from the funding group, Sarah and George.
Sure, thanks, Deborah. We spent a little bit of time with George Collier from the state telling us about the great grant program, obviously of large interest to everyone on this call today, kind of going over some of the frequently asked questions about that program. I think one of the conversation topics of interest to the larger group that came out of our breakout is around the concerns with the RDOF awards that were made, and the ineligibility for the great program that those awards created, largely with, I think, Charter in the Southwestern region winning a lot of that auction, and the uncertainty as to whether they will actually come in and serve those areas. And in the meantime, our inability to apply for great funds as a result. So I think what came out of that, and Nathan Ramsey put this in the chat, and I agree with him on this, is a real need to advocate to our legislators on that RDOF, very specific RDOF issue. If they don't know about it, they can't help with it. George, Angie, was there anything else you'd like to add?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay.
Silence on the other end. I think George and Angie have to talk so often. They're very excited about not having to do
All right.
the
Thank you.
I think what's so interesting about the RDOF issue that many people have mentioned is I'm hoping that there will be a very creative solution to that sometimes in other intractable problems, we end up, going around it instead of through it, the way I think we're trying to do with that RDOF now. So that's exciting. Our fourth group was Future Steps. And I think, Mark, would you give a summary of that, please?
I'd be glad to. Bill does what he does best. He delegated and got me to stand in for him. So we had a great discussion. We actually started with a question that everybody was supposed to answer, and that's the one thing they'd like to have in place 5 years from now to help with connectivity, digital inclusion, all of this in order to help the region do better. And that's based on the fact that 6 years ago we started, and it was just get broadband to people, just get connectivity, just get the fiber into their homes. And now it's moved to, well, you got to get them access, and you got to help them understand how to use the devices and use that access. And now it's digital inclusion, and we're expanding the role of what this effort needs to do. And so that question was leading to, okay, so what do we do next? What's the next thing to happen? So the 4 takeaways that I took out of this, and then we'll let Bill pipe in and tell all the things I missed. Connectivity is still key, even though there's more money than any of us ever thought would be put towards this. There's a bunch of it coming. We're going to go from, I don't know what we're at, 96% access to 98.5%. There's still going to be a percentage that's not there. And one of the comments was insightful for all of us is, and then there are also rural areas that people want connectivity. When you're hiking in the forest, you don't have access in order to get good directions. You can't use the services. And I know some of us would like to get away from the technology while we're out hiking in the forest, but there's still a lot of reasons why you need some of that technology in rural locations other than someone's home. And so that was a good insight. There was kind of an agreement that we need to help find ways to enhance people's skills. So it's not just give them access so that they can take a class, it's so that they can figure out how to do the next skill in order to solve a problem they have, in order to start a business, in order to enhance their skills so they can move from one position they're at to the next level position, which leads to the third one is you need a personal driver. What is it that people are it's going to drive someone to want to pay the money, to want to connect, to want to go learn that skill or take that next level of education? The what's in it for me attitude, which drives everybody, right? Whatever that is, if I can't learn it, if I'm going to do this, great, I can watch videos. But what I really want to do is learn how to do something to enhance my ability to be successful, whatever that is.
Mhm.
It could be better farming. It could be use data to improve your crop outcomes. It could be how to help your faith-based organization to attract more people, you name it, right? Whatever you're trying. And then the last one is to leverage the entire ecosystem. You have shown through today that there is an enormous ecosystem of people working together in order to try and solve this problem, bigger than it ever was when we started 6 years ago. When we started, it was municipal people. It was a few people that thought connectivity was important. It is now a huge group of folks that are trying to help their neighbors, that are trying to help their municipalities, that are trying to help their friends, that are doing everything. And that ecosystem, you have to leverage it. And we have to try and, through things like organizations like this, try to get them to work together. Don't compete with each other, but collaborate and try and figure out how each of us can own a piece and do the piece that helps move us forward.
Thank you.
There you
Thank
go.
you so much. That was a great summary and sort of brought in pieces of all the different focus areas and the whole thing. So I'd like to sort of sum up and then turn it over to Cedarburg so he could finish this up for us. But this Broadband Summit has given us a lot of new connections, perspectives, ideas. Each one of these I've really enjoyed going to for broadband. And now we've added digital inclusion on this one. We'd like each to leave with an individual and a collective call to action to make universal broadband access and inclusion a reality sooner rather than later. We'd like each one of you to add to your professional and personal objectives 1 or 2 specific things that you can do to move the work of broadband access ahead. If you're a legislator or legislative staff, how can you align, change, adjust our local, state, and federal laws to face the reality of some of our issues on the ground? If you're an educator or a student, how can you learn more about broadband mapping, educate others on broadband technologies? If you're with a county, if you're a government, a state, federal employee, have you worked with your group to make financial and personnel commitments to make broadband access a reality? We've got so many resources from the Council of Governments. I'd really like to thank Land to Sky and Southwestern. They've been really critical to the work in Haywood County, and I know across the state. And the North Carolina Broadband Office, and we didn't see Keith, but shout out to Keith, are just absolutely fantastic with their assistance, their response, their sensitivity. But there are also many, many untapped community members with technical, managerial, communication, community organizing skills that we're finding useful and that can be organized into your committees. So we're hoping to send you off enthusiastic about the new world. And I'd like to call on Bill to close us out.
And thank you, Deborah, for your personal engagement in this. Those of you that don't know, she's been an incredibly positive force in Haywood County and is contributing just as a citizen to helping the county. So thank you for what you have accomplished in that. Now, my job is to do a little wrap up. First of all, I want to comment that Keith Conover didn't win that poll results. And I think that must have been skewed because when I saw his name pop up in that survey question, I just knew Keith was going to walk away and win that competition. So you may want to look at that, Sarah. But my job is to say thanks to everybody that has been involved with this project over 6 years, and we've made great strides. And before I officially thank people, there's one person that has really been particularly helpful, and that's Stag Newman. Stag is a retired FCC technologist. In a little paper that he and I have written about our observations about broadband, I mentioned that Stag is one of the intellectual leaders of this whole project, at least regionally. Stag, are you still on? Do you want to add one last comment?
Am I off mute? I think I am.
You are.
Okay. Yeah, I just, thanks to everybody. And I guess 2 real quick observations. One is I think we in Western North Carolina really have to roll up our sleeves to solve our problem because the state official and FCC official numbers probably understate by 90% the number of unserved, that we probably have 10 times more than numbers, and our cost is much higher. So I think the challenge is ahead of us. We've got the resources to do it. Hopefully there's more than enough money to go around. And then I think what came out so clearly today is then the challenge is the digital inclusion. If we get the infrastructure built, we've got to get everybody using it. So lots of work for those of us, particularly those of you who have far more expertise than I do in digital inclusion. Thanks to Bill and everybody for putting this together.
All right, thank you, Steve. And thanks to Sarah Nichols, who continue to do a phenomenal job at Land of Sky and on this project. Working with her is Kayla Christina, who has helped with this technology. Students from UNCA, Kennedy Young, Wes Bryant, and Braden Ball, phenomenally helpful. Mark Zarnecki, who runs the website and is our digital navigator, lead advocate in all of this. Faculty member Sonia Diploma has been involved with us and students from her class. And so thanks to everybody. And I don't have anything else other to say than thank you for all you do for broadband. And we look forward to continue to work with you. So have a great day. And I just wanted to point out to Sarah that we're about on time. So thanks for everybody's good work.